Good evening. And thank you for joining us on such well, if you're at home, it's wonderful and welcome, but since we have an in-house audience, thank you for joining us on such a dark and drizzly night, but for a wonderful subject. I'm Deirdre Cross, and I'm the Director of the Office of Public Programs at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And it's a pleasure to welcome you to tonight's program in the museum's Historically Speaking series, which features discussions of memoirs, scholarly text, and biographies such as A Passionate Mind and Relentless Pursuit by Professor Noliwe Rooks, who we'll hear from this evening. In A Passionate Mind, Professor Noliwe Rooks presents a very artful and analytical view of Mrs. Mary McCleod Bethune and her great ambition, her entrepreneurial drive, and her tireless fight for social justice. As the National Museum of African American History and Culture recently opened an exhibition entitled Forces for Change, Mary McCleod Bethune and Black Women's Activism, we are indeed very fortunate that Professor Rooks has joined us this evening in the Oprah Winfrey Theater. And now I present to you Professor Noliwe Rooks.
Hey everybody, look at people did come out. We were driving in from Baltimore, and let me tell you, I told Bill, you know, there'll be no person in the audience. The traffic is bad, the weather is bad. I appreciate y'all being here. I have to give a shout out to my beloved Bill Gaskins, who's driving me around in the traffic here. Let's give a little shout out to Bill. And my mother has organized much of the California Mendocino coast to tune in tonight. So, hey, Belvy Jean. And all of the folks up in Mendocino. I really appreciate y'all coming, and I get to talk about one of my favorite topics. I don't have a formal presentation. I just want to tell you some stories and tell you some things that I think you should know and that I want you to know about Mary McCleod Bethune, especially in this moment that we find ourselves in, where we are contemplating democracy, its nature, its essence, its viability. I think she has some things that we should know. I want to start really by just telling you how I came to write this book, really quickly. The most direct reason that I wrote the book had to do with I got a phone call asking if I wanted to write a book about a Black woman, who would I write about? But the way that I think, grabbed onto Mary McCleod Bethune, I've thought about for some time. Like, why, when I was asked, if you could write about anybody, living or dead, who would you write about? My agent called me up one day in the middle of just nowhere, in response to hello. She was like, if you could write about anybody you want to, who would you write about? And I was like, yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think I said Mary Church Terrell or Anna Jewel, you got like somebody. And she was like, yeah, no, do better. Okay, could you give me context? Can you give me some, like a container that will help me do better? I respond well to competition. So you did bad, I want to do better. She was like, no, come on, think about it. Somebody who you would connect with and want to write about. And I blurted out Mary McCleod Bethune and then spent a bunch of time trying to remember or call up why. Why had her name come to me? One of the things that I settled on was an image. And the image was my grandmother's house, or my grandparents' house. But my grandfather died when I was about 6 or 7, so though I knew them both, I came to adulthood thinking of it as her house. And there was this little low table in between the kitchen and the dining room that had her most precious photographs on them. Now, I've spent some time thinking about what made them so, but that would not be the point of bringing it up. The photographs were my first birthday. their wedding, my grandparents' wedding anniversary. My father in little short pants playing a violin. He played the violin for a while. It was a curated collection of what was most special, and I'm sure most folks have something like this in their home, these historical photographs. On top of them, on top of the actual table where the photographs were, was a portrait of Mary McCleod Bethune. So it's this tableau that I literally learned to walk. Like I pull myself up, I'm told, on this little table. My first birthday, my second, third, fourth birthday was right here by this table. And it occurred to me, I knew Mary McCleod Bethune was special before I had voice and language to explain why, because my grandmother valued her. One of the images on this table was my grandmother's graduation photo from Bethune-Cookman. So I always knew there was something about her, and in this moment, when the question was asked, there's something, I don't know, it was my grandparents, it was Bethune, I don't know what it was, but it said, you need to find out more about this woman. And one of the things I discovered is I didn't know enough about her. I thought I knew a lot about her. So I'm gonna tell you some disconnected stories. I have not even put the sum total of who she is and why I've put maybe a third of what I would like to say to you about who she is. But Mary McCleod Bethune is such a figure. What is it? Bill sometimes said she too tall to get over, too wide to get around. That you could, in a talk trying to explain her significance, spend the entire time just listing what she did. She hit the sort of public Black political sphere. She hit it hard, and she hit it with an ethic. I should say this better. She was very productive in the political sphere, and she had a real vision and a North Star. I call her North Star freedom for Black children and Black women. There's no period of her life. She cared about a lot of people. This is not me saying that she was only here in service to Black women and children. But the consistent, the drumbeat, the backbeat, the thing that makes her life make sense is if you think about how anything she did, how would it have impacted the greatest number of women and children? The first incident, or the first kind of time that I can find her in history making a significant kind of impact is in 1918, her son's, fighting in World War I. And at the time, of course, the Red Cross believed that white blood was for white people, Black blood was for Black people. They did not actually even take blood from Black people because they didn't want it to get confused. And so soldiers who were fighting were in this constant kind of need. Doctors who were taking care of the soldiers were constantly saying, we don't have enough blood. There's not enough Black soldiers. We can't give the white blood to. And so in 1918, she harassed those people in writing and in protest and with logic. As someone who at the time did not have a platform, she did not work for the government. She had not founded a school. She had founded a school. She did have some kinds of political connections, but this is the first thing that I find about her where she is changing the nature of democracy and access and inclusion at a federal level. And then you can just see, so when saying that Black women and children were her North Star, voting rights, she is central to Black women, Black people in the vote. I'll tell you a story a little bit later about that will make some sense. In 1924, she's elected president of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, and she beats Ida B. Wells to do it. It is just this fascinating story where Ida B. Wells had been lobbying for this job for a decade. She wanted to take over this club and the presidency. And Bethune ran against her, and Ida B. Wells was one of Bethune's sheroes. There was not animosity. She was inspired by her, but she wanted to do some things with the club women. She wanted to take them in directions she hadn't seen. She wanted to turn them into a body that lobbied for rights, that did more than charity and uplift, and I'm not denigrating those things, but she wanted to have people who were what she called these active citizens, where women were trying to gain office, where instead of supporting a male power structure, her thing was, at what point do women get to actually hold power? And so that was a part of her campaign thing. And then, of course, she met Eleanor Roosevelt in 1927, and things go in a whole different direction. So the two of them meet at a tea that Eleanor Roosevelt's mother-in-law, FDR's mother, was hosting. FDR's mother, Nancy, was a club woman, a white woman's club woman. And when Bethune showed up at this tea to foster interracial cooperation between white women's clubs and black women's clubs, the white women who were there they weren't used to socializing with black people. This was in New York, and when Bethune walked in, they were scandalized, and they said, we're gonna need you to, she can't sit with us. What? She could be here if you just want her here. She makes you happy. But obviously, she's not going to be sitting and drinking and eating with us. And Eleanor Roosevelt said, well, she's going to be sitting right next to me. If y'all have an issue with that, you can go or you can stay. But she's going to be right here. And the two of them developed a really close friendship, or a political partnership is probably a better way to talk about it. But that was in the context, again, of Bethune advocating for black women's club work. And then there's the list of presidents who she worked for. And when she hits the scene, of course, she's doing child welfare here in DC. She's the reason that there are vaccination campaigns, that smallpox, or she's on the commission. She's not, I tend to blow her up kind of right. Like, she's the reason all the things happen. She was the one black woman and black person on any of these commissions. So these things that happened, she stood alone, and she first is really advocating for the humanity of black children in these moments, for the ways that as the nation begins to talk about childhood and protecting children and innocence, there's a conception of childhood that starts to come about right about this time, where we don't want children to be working full days. Perhaps we should protect them because they're children, not just workers. So child labor laws are brought into effect. Perhaps we want to make sure children are educated well. So you start to get truancy laws, and you start to get you have to go to school kind of laws, and let's make it possible for black children to do it too. So that's how she sort of first, hits the stage. I'm not going to go through all that because I don't have all that. Now, I talked a little bit about the relationship. I know it's cringe. It's cringe, it's amazing and cringe at the same time. And, but I still think people should see it. So, but I get how it's cringe. So the two of them, as I said, had met in 1927. This is before FDR was in the White House. He was a year before he was elected governor of New York. So, and this is in what, 1955 maybe, 1954? 53, yeah. So this is the arc. This is an arc of their relationship, and they were indeed very friendly. I'll tell you one story about them, about how Mrs. Bethune and Eleanor Roosevelt helped to bring the Tuskegee Airmen into being. So Ms. Bethune had a real passion for anything that was happening with the federal government, making sure it included Black people. She understood Black women to need training and jobs. She understood Black men to need training and jobs. She understood Black citizens to need pensions and military pay. And so she's a big advocate for desegregating the military. 90% of the reason she wants to give you for the desegregation has to do with economic betterment, the lack of opportunity for Black people in the nation, the narrow job prospects that Black folks in the South and poor Black people had before them. And from what she could see from 1918 on, if you move toward in this direction, perhaps you can make a better world for you and yours. And she went in that direction hard. And so when they decided to start, when FDR decided to start a civilian pilot program, because there weren't enough civilian pilots, we're not in World War II yet, it's the late 1930s, but they were thinking, if there's a war, because, Hitler and them were sort of starting to act up, if we end up having to have a war, we don't have enough pilots. And we need to fill in with civilian pilots. So they started a national program that, of course, at least initially, was not to include Black people. And Mrs. Bethune at the time was working as part of the National Youth Administration. She was the first Black person to head a federal agency. And this federal agency was part of the civilian pilot training program. And so since she was in charge of the Negro division of it, she said, I want Black colleges included. I want Black pilots to have the opportunity to actually learn to fly planes. I want Black women included because I want them to be trained as nurses. And so if we can get for each Black school a cohort, you get a pilot, you get a whole infrastructure that comes along with this new program. And she was successful in having 7 Black colleges, Tuskegee among them, Howard among them, getting involved in it. But FDR, because of pressure from the Southern members of Congress, had no real desire to integrate the military. He had other things he was trying to do with New Deal legislation, and the Southerners were not friendly toward this. But she persisted and called on her friend, Eleanor, and they came up with this plan where they went to Tuskegee, gave the Secret Service a complete heart attack because in a moment, Eleanor decided she's going to go up in a plane with the Black flight instructor, just the 2 of them. It had not been cleared. No one had ever heard anything, but the 2 of them had talked about it, and they were like, okay, we're going to push the envelope. And really, what were they going to do? Tell First Lady she couldn't get in the thing. So basically, she was kind of like, you'll be okay. I'm getting in the plane. And they flew around for about an hour, came back down, and went back to DC and began to harangue FDR about desegregating the military. They harangued him to such an extent that he did sign an executive order about 8 years before Truman actually got it done. FDR signed an executive order integrating the military, but of course those Southerners, upon finding out about the executive order, protested, and again, it was another 8 years, and Truman had to actually sign the legislation to get it done. But the 2 of them, there's a number of stories about the 2 of them teaming up, bringing pressure, pushing the envelope. For Bethune, it was always about building better Black institutions, supporting Black communities, Black institutions, Black organizations, so that to try to build up an infrastructure. This is one of her quotes that I honestly, let me just say, I just thought it was apropos at this time. Because one of the things that in history, I grew up, I'm ashamed to say now, actually thinking that Mary McCleod Bethune was a kind of accommodationist to white power, because I only ever heard about her with FDR. It wasn't clear to me what she was doing. I just didn't know. I was ignorant, is the best way to say. But this question of democracy and military service and patriotism is and has always been a robust topic of conversation in Black communities. And the Black presence in the federal government, in the apparatus of citizenship, likewise, has regularly been a topic of conversation. And because Mrs. Bethune is in part responsible for moving the Black vote from Republican, because Abraham Lincoln, of course, was a Republican, and so it's until the late 1930s, the majority of Black people vote Republican, because Lincoln signed that order. Mrs. Bethune comes along, her friendship with FDR, her placement in the federal government, her relentless pursuit of justice for Black people in terms of dollars, in terms of access, in terms of opportunity. She said, one of her quotes is, if Mrs. Bethune can but get her foot in the door, she will hold it open for another generation of Black women to walk through. And that's a thing that she lived repeatedly. And that for her, I mean, one of the things that I believe is that Mrs. Bethune understood love to be a verb. She understood it to be active. She talked about love and care of Black people, Black communities, but she activated it in a way that if you don't understand who she is in its totality, it is easy to see she was just running around in Washington, D.C., bettering herself and not really understanding the full story. So the three stories that I think that I'm going to tell really fast, that I think really kind of explain, what did I say, the last of the faith and love are verbs? Something key about who she was. So she was the first in her family to have been born free. She's number 15 of 17 children. The 14 children before her, as well as her parents, were enslaved. She's born in 1875, right at when Reconstruction is coming to an end. She was born free during an era when repression and race-based violence is resurfacing. So her first moments are navigating this idea of liberation and freedom. They were liberated, but were her family actually free? The reason that I think about that like that is when freedom came, when they were all called into the town square to have the Emancipation Proclamation read and told that, you know, you are free now, a lot of Black folks took to the road. You know, freedom meant you could move. Freedom meant you could go find your people, you could go find some you could move freely. And a lot of folks took off behind the Union soldiers or took off for parts unknown, experiencing these freedom. Sam and Patsy, Mrs. Bethune's parents, was sort of like, we got 17 kids. Well, they had 15, 16 kids at that point. And we don't know where they all are. We can either get up and go somewhere. We don't know where we'd be going. We don't know any people. We don't know, we haven't been any place very far from Maysville, South Carolina, where they were. Or we can figure out how to stay here and reassemble our family. So what they decided to do was to go to their respective owners. They were owned by two different people, walking distance from, they lived on the McLeod plantation, but the McIntoshes did not live far away. So they came up with the plan. They both went to their owners and they said, you know, we will stay here. We will call all of our children back. They will bring their wives, they will bring their kids, and we'll work this land for you. We won't leave. But for every year that we work this land, we need an acre. And at the end of 5 years, then you can start paying us. But we'll do this for you for 5 years, but then y'all go and you make it possible for us to own land. And they agreed, the McLeods agreed, and they called their children back, and they called their grandkids back, and they worked that land, and they became landowners. And that allowed them they could feed themselves because there was land that they could plant and grow. They could build cabins because there was timber, and they made their home there. I mention that as something I think of as formative for Mrs. Bethune, because at every stage of her progress, of movement, as she's moving south, north, she's in DC, in New York, she is always arguing that Black people need to own something, and that they need to they need to be as self-sufficient as they can. They need to know who's going to provide them health care. She founds the first hospital in Florida for Black people. And she founds the hospital because one of the students at Bethune-Cookman goes to the white hospital with appendicitis, or appendix is about to burst, and the only way the doctors will see this young woman, a 16-year-old child, is to operate on her on the back porch with limited anesthesia. They tortured that child as far as Mrs. Bethune was concerned. And when she came to visit, she heard her student had gone off and she came to visit. She found her out in the cold, not being well cared for, and she says she decided right then she was going to Morehouse and she was going to Meharry Black medical schools, and she was gonna go find some doctors who needed to do their residencies, and she was gonna found a hospital so doctors could come do their residencies there. And then she founded a nursing program so Black women could also be trained in healthcare. And again, first hospital in Florida, functioned for 15 years. It successfully, Black doctors flocked to the area. It really was a training ground. And there was a complete nursing program that becomes important when World War II, when Black women start to enter the military in different kinds of ways. So she was consistently about stand your ground and build up your institutions. And I think those early moments are why. Another thing about her is she was born with a caul over her face. It's a placenta set, but in Black spiritualist teaching, for rural folks at least, there's a whole connection between spirituality and being born with a caul. W.B. Du Bois talks about being a seventh son of the seventh son born with a caul on his face as a way of making clear what he thought allowed him a kind of second sight. That's Du Bois. That he said it made it possible for him to see inside of America in ways that not everyone could. Bethune was also born with a caul on her face, and from her earliest years, people consistently just talked about her as just special. There's just something about her that's not like other people. She first goes to school, learns to read at 12. A bunch of teachers Methodist teachers come south. You got to find some people willing to teach Black children. You had to pay at this point to go to school. So they're going door to door saying, we can take 12, 15, 20 kids max. We have some donations, people from the north, our church is raising. We can take a certain number of kids. We need people to tell us who we should be thinking about. We're gonna have to make some decisions. And so one day a teacher comes and knocks on their front door and says, we've been going around and people keep telling us that Mary, if we're gonna teach somebody something, Mary needs to be the first in the class. And the parents are sort of like, at least initially, like, that's nice for you. She's hands that are helping us work. Going off to school, the school was 2 miles away, so it was a 2-mile walk there and back. Her spending all day in school is not going to help us get this work done. And what is that even going to do for, like, what the idea of letters and reading was not a motivation, at least initially. Workers, motivations for her parents, but they talk about it some, and what they decide is that she will go to the school. They'll let her do it, they'll let her try it out, but that every day that she comes back, she has to teach her brothers and sisters and nieces and nephews what she learned. Doesn't matter how tired she is, and she got chores to do. She didn't get out of chores. But doesn't matter how tired she is, doesn't matter. You come back here and you teach them what you know. And as she taught them, again, there are quite a few of them, the word started to get around, and she became the eyes and ears and decipherer of letters for the entire community. So when people's families had gone off north, we're sending letters back for people without literacy. It's lacking in meaning. So they had newspapers, black newspapers. Pullman Porters are in various ways bringing black newspapers to the South. Those communities couldn't read them because literacy had been so denied. And at a young age, as young as 12 years old, her role became going door to door, house to house. You got some words you need me to read? She also did math that helped as the sharecroppers were bringing in their various crops with the scales. You know, as always, people maybe not reading the scales exactly right. People may be shortchanging these folks who were farmers. And she began to go and explain, well, no, that's a little bit wrong. Or do we want, but she's a little kid, so she did not actually raise great concern. She became a community resource at a very early age because her family required it of her. I think that's something else that stayed with her. Like, as I try to figure out, how do you go from sharecropper, no advantages, in a moment in Black political history where the folks who are doing big things, W.E.B. Du Bois, Mary Church Terrell, Anna Julia Cooper, doing great, Carter Woodson, doing amazing things, but they're going to the top schools in the country. Du Bois, Woodson, they went to Harvard. Mary Church Terrell is at Oberlin, and they're doing classical study. They're speaking Greek and Latin. They are being educated at the highest levels of Western tradition. And she went to Scotia College, and she went to Moody College of Bible. That was her formal training. She learned to preach. She was evangelical. Her faith was shaped at a very early age by her parents, not the people who she ran off to, but they put a finishing touch on it. So she wanted to go to Africa. She wanted to be a missionary. She said, you know, the Methodists were sending folks off to be missionaries in Africa, so she's at Moody College of Bible, and she just assumed everybody else is going to Africa to be a missionary. I, too, am going to go to Africa. So, of course, when she finishes her course of study, she says, all right, where's my assignment? Can't wait to go. She had grown up with stories of her grandmother, who she'd always heard was from someplace called Senegal. And she had a whole thing about what the woman looked like. And she used to say that she would show up in her dreams. And they talked about the ship, like somehow, if it was passed down to her, she had a whole history of this connection to Africa through her grandmother. And she wanted to go back to the country. So she was completely broken when the Methodists said, we don't send Black people to Africa. We're trying to civilize the Africans. Why would we send Black people to do that? We want to send white missionaries because it helps with the civilizing project. And she grieved that for some time. She saw her life as ministering there. And then she says, somebody came to her, and said, but there are Black people here. You know, can't go to Africa. You find your ministry here. So she's almost a spiritualist. There's ways, I haven't heard anybody talk about her like that, but there's social justice, there's women. who connected Harriet Tubman. There's Taya Miles's new book about Harriet Tubman is just this kind of argument about how there's this spiritual connection that some women take and turn into a political kind of practice. And in that ways, Bethune really was very much like that. And like I said, I really feel like for her, faith and love were verbs. She put them into constant kind of action. But you cannot understand Mrs. Bethune without understanding her faith, and you cannot understand her without understanding her belief that children were worth all the effort and all the time. So much of what she did at her school, she and others, but what she was really committed to was creating a curriculum that would teach Black children who they were in the world, to build up their self-concept, to have comic books that you could pass out to the kids. You could teach them how to read with the comic books, but there are all these stories of great escapes. Ellen Craft escaping from enslavement with her husband as they cross-dress and print it. I mean, she turns them into these sweeping kinds of narratives. They're comic books, and this is what they're giving children to read. She's constantly showing up in public and saying, there's nothing more important than us making sure that these babies understand who they are, who they can be, and we have to start early before the world teaches them who they can't be. And it was key for her. So in 1904, she founds a school for her son and 4 little girls. This is not obviously that. This is the earliest photo, though, that we have of Mrs. Bethune and the children from her school. And as she founded it, as she talked about why, one of the things that she taught them is here, that this quote, that as Black people rose, she believed that Black people were going to rise to heights. She believed that while we had power in a faith-filled, humanity-significant way, but as we gained power in the ways that the larger community gained power, she consistently wanted people to think about power and humility. And this is a part of what she worked into the curriculum of the school. But at the same time, she trained teachers. I know from my grandparents and others who went to the school, a couple named Harry and Harriet Moore, who ended up being the first martyrs, some people say, of the civil rights movement. They were from Florida. They were both graduates of Bethune-Cookman. They knew her, and they worked together. And for my grandparents, for them, for knowing there was this whole interconnected group of Black teachers who got educated at Bethune-Cookman. And for those teachers, they consistently connected what was happening in classrooms. They talked to students about power and voting and patience and organizing and dignity over and over and over. And when they began an assault on the structures of segregation, Thurgood Marshall, who was very close with Mrs. Bethune, he cuts his teeth doing teacher education, teacher equalization cases in Florida, working with some of the graduates from Bethune-Cookman and Mrs. Bethune. And when they're going to court, and Thurgood Marshall, he's winning a bunch. Like, he's going to court, they were taking it up to the Supreme Court saying, the Constitution says, we are equal, we are citizens, we are not debased citizens. You have to pay, the states have to pay Black teachers and white teachers the same amount of money. He won regularly. And when those teachers walked out of those courtrooms, very often the Klan beat them bloody, or ran them out of town, or fired them. So it wasn't breaking the back of the oppression that they were worried about, and all the teachers are getting fired. And so, people are kind of like, I need my job. I'm not going to go up to the Supreme Court running around. I need my job. So Ms. Bethune had founded an insurance agency earlier before she got to Daytona, Central Life Insurance Agency. And what she did with that insurance company is any teachers who were fired, she gave them jobs in the insurance company for as long as they needed it. So they put their necks out there because they thought they had a strategy, right? They thought, we can shame them, the courts will believe us. If we do it enough, this argument about our equality and humanity is gonna work. And it did work, it's just everybody kept getting fired and beaten. And so before giving up that strategy, though, she was like, well, let's try to take care of the people. And maybe if we can just hold on a little bit more. All these people ended up being teachers who taught Black children, and those lessons that they learned from Bethune seeped their way into classrooms in ways we can follow and ways we cannot. But about what your pushback is like, what your courage is like, how straight is your back, how steady is your breath in moments of terror. This is not the moment that this happened, but in 1920, in the first election after the 19th Amendment was passed, Mrs. Bethune would teach literacy classes because Florida was one of the states that was big for literacy tests if you wanted to vote. You had to stand there and whatever the registrar gave you, you had to read it. It could be the Constitution, it could be, literacy is low. They're giving you very difficult things. You couldn't pass it, you couldn't vote. Or there were poll taxes. So you had to come bring $1, pay an extra $1 for the right to vote. Mrs. Bethune has got the whole school baking sweet potato pies. She's running around selling, having raffles to raise money for the community to be able to pay their poll taxes. So the election becomes a very school-centered kind of moment where making sure that as many women, because the first time women can vote, as possible, get to the polls here in Daytona, Florida. A part of Florida that has never been kind to Black people, ever. This is the part of Florida, Sanford, where in some ways with Trayvon Martin's murder, it's right here, begins a whole era of activism. So she's spending all this time telling people we need to vote and raising money, and she got this bicycle and she's riding around and she's telling everybody. And so the Klan finally says, okay, this is enough. You're making inroads. People seem to think they should be able to vote. And you raising money to pay for them to be able to vote? No. So they tell her to cut it out. She ignores them. So they tell the city officials, we want to go scare her some. We're going to go scare her a little bit. We need you to turn off all the lights in town. So it's pitch black, and which the officials do. And so as it gets dark, and some people had warned her, they told her, something is going on. Something's going to happen tonight. You might want to leave. You might want to, they're serious. They're upset. And she was like, I'm not leaving. I mean, that's not going to happen. But some of the Black men in the community secreted themselves around the grounds with guns, and they were prepared to do battle with the Klan. This was going to be but everybody knew. If you start shooting at Klan members, white people, no one, it's not going to end well for anybody. But the community was like, we're not really going to let them come and harm Mrs. Bethune, who's teaching our babies and teaching them well. So the Klan come, it's dead dark. All you can see are torches. All you can hear are hoofbeats. There's about 80 of them in a line, in a column. They walk in one door. They walk in the front gates of the school, where in one, they came a couple times. First time they came, what she did was gather all of the teachers, the children, the custodial staff, everybody with breath who was willing. And they stood on the front steps of Faith Hall, and they sang, God will take care of you, as the Klan walked in. And I don't know if it was like the Klan, if it was God, if it was the melody, I don't know. But they walked in one gate and they rode out another gate. They didn't stop. They didn't harass her. And when she was questioned about why would you have children, like why wouldn't you go keep them safe? And she was like, they need to learn how to have a straight back. We would have kept them, I mean, if things jumped off, we had plans. But they need to know. They need to know early, and they need to know courage. And this is the best way I can teach them to survive. So that's a combination of her love for children and her understanding of what survival looked like. This is a picture of me and my grandmother at American Beach, Florida, which is one of the beaches that she helped found. She and another, A.L. Lewis, who is actually Johnetta Coles, his great-grandfather, and the first millionaire in Florida, founded a beach for Black people. And it's a phenomenal beach because unlike a lot of beaches that were founded around, I think Martha's Vineyard, like there's Black beaches all over the country, like north, south. This was for working class Black people. And it was for working class Black people who, they made it possible, they used the finances from the insurance company to make mortgages possible. They wrote mortgages. So everybody from the secretary to domestic workers could buy a little plot of land here. And the motto was relaxation without humiliation. So this idea that relaxation is a part of a Black freedom struggle, that founding a beach specifically so Black folks from different walks of life can know this kind of peace and freedom. My grandparents bought property there in the 1940s, and somehow Mrs. Bethune got Truman to deed 100 acres of land to this beach project. It was federal land. That second 100 acres, they didn't have to pay for it. I can't find what she did to say you those records. The attorney who brokered that deal, they were lost. There was a fire. And so all of the records of how that came to be, that the US government gave 100 acres of beachfront property to Mrs. Bethune. I'm getting the high sign, but there's a whole story to talk about Mrs. Bethune and artists and Black artists. The one thing I will say is the first theater program in the country at a HBCU was founded at Bethune-Cookman, and Mrs. Bethune hired Zora Neale Hurston to run it. Hurston could only really stand that area and that school for a couple years. However, she did found it, and there's all these stories of the imaginations of Black kids thinking about theater that they had never seen before. Is there anything else? This is actually from the exhibition upstairs. And I just can't think of a better way to end. Thank y'all. So I think if you guys have questions, we have some time. Oh, you have the questions?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm coming with you?
Yes, come right over.
Let's do that.
Thanks again for a wonderful presentation. We have questions from the digital audience as well as our in-person. Is yours?
If I can figure out on, that would be good. I got it.
Oh, you got it?
Don't do it? No, there it is. Got it.
Okay. So I think our first question is, it has more to do with mentorship and the type of relationships that existed among very powerful Black women in the early to mid 20th century. And this question is, what can you tell us about Dr. Bethune's relationship and mentorship of Dorothy Height?
Oh my God, yes. I just don't even know where to start with that. Ashley Robertson Preston is a professor here at Howard. She's the leading Bethune scholar in the world. She's written, I think, 3 books. We got another couple going. And what she often says is, some people just get bit by the Bethune bug. You start hearing about her, and you want to know more. You become inspired by who she was and what she did, and you want to be in her presence. This is what happened with Dorothy Height, but Dorothy Height actually was alive when Mrs. Bethune was alive, and Mrs. Bethune saw that spark in her, where the work of protecting children, building Black institutions, having faith, teaching children about culture and faith. She saw a kindred spirit, and she nurtured her, and she opened doors, and then she anointed her, basically, as her mentee, as the one who should take over the organization that she founded, who should pick up that torch and carry it. And because Mrs. Bethune was how she was or who she was, Dorothy Height was relentless. You talk about somebody relentless about keeping the spirit of Mary McCleod Bethune alive. The statue in Lincoln Park, about a mile from here, owes everything to the in 1974, decades after Mrs. Bethune had passed. Dorothy Height was like, National Park Service, we're going to need a statue, and we're going to need y'all to take care of it. And 18,000 people showed up at that park to celebrate Mary McCleod Bethune because of what Dorothy Height did. Now, I don't know who Dorothy Height mentored, and that's something, I honestly don't know. I'm not saying she did or didn't, I honestly don't know. And I do wonder if that chain was broken in a way.
Yeah. Well,
but don't know.
something to research, and in the near term. In addition to that question, here's another where the questioner asked about the fact that Ida B. Wells was an influence on Dr. Bethune in her, but who else was a role model for Dr. Bethune in your research?
She was very close with Madam C.J. Walker, Mrs. Joyner, who was the head of the Black Beauticians Association. The two of them were tight. There was, oh shoot, who's Howard Thurman's wife? I hate to refer to her like that because she is amazing in her own right. Sue Bailey Thurman, an amazing figure. And they were like a group. Yeah, there was a whole, the Black club women movement was national, it was international, and these Black women who were really thinking it's the women's age. This is a period of time where people were like, it's women's time. 1920s, Black women were really feeling, we're coming of age, something is changing. We can push forward, we can win some things, we can do some things. And these women that I mentioned, along with Mrs. Bethune, were at the front and center. It's not like they just one day woke up and said, hey, let's start founding clubs. Political conditions had created a little space, just a little opening. Door opened a little bit. And given that opportunity, there was a whole group of influential, creative, brilliant Black women who busted it down, whose names we don't call that much anymore. This is one thing, let me say. As I was researching Mrs. Bethune, I got angry, and I stay angry that more people don't know about her. I'm sort of like, what do you have to do to be remembered regularly when you look at everything that Mrs. Bethune did, what she left, who she inspired, what she built, what she meant to people? And we rarely talk about, in this last presidential election, everyone kept saying, oh, Shirley Chisholm. No disrespect to Shirley Chisholm. Shirley Chisholm was the honorary head of the Lincoln Park Statue Committee. She had a lot of respect for Mary McCleod Bethune. But I don't know how you forget Bethune when you're talking about Black women in democracy, or Black women in the federal government. I don't know how her name doesn't come up, but it doesn't. It rarely does. And I really don't understand that erasure.
Well, I think it's an interesting comment that you just made, because in the museum we do have I think, one of the foundational sections of the community galleries does look at the contributions and the impact of Bethune. And I'm wondering what you think, what she would think, any insights as to what she might feel about having her life memorialized, documented, preserved in such a way.
She believed in collecting and protecting and curating documents and lives. So she made sure that Frederick Douglass's home here in DC was renovated and became a public, she saved it from ruin and bankruptcy, basically, because she said he was important enough. Howard Thurman's home in Daytona, same thing. Saved it, turned it into a museum to make sure that people could see it. She started a Black Women's Archive. She said, I think she got this from Du Bois. I've never actually seen this, but Du Bois was busy trying to do an encyclopedia of all the knowledge of Black people everywhere in the world, like it was this big project. And, or maybe he got it from her, actually, because I think she was a little earlier. She had decided what she wanted to do was collect all the knowledge of Black women from all over the world. Like, just get it all the books, the writings, the thinking, the papers, let's go. And so at Council House, she started, there's a pretty good start to that. So I would imagine she'd be thrilled that she was receiving the same kind of attention.
Well, I think that it's very interesting that we started off with an exhibition that looked at her life, but over the 8 years of this museum, there've been opportunities to really measure her impact, and it also includes information about a number of other women as activists. So she continues, her legacy continues. There's another question that we have here, and it has to do with the range of organizations that she founded or was a part of. And in your research, were you able to see how she was able to balance her role as leadership in government of a major research and educational institution and these women's clubs, Delta Sigma Theta, the Order of the Eastern Star, National Council of Negro Women, and beyond?
Yeah, she very much, again, she actually gets her start in Florida as the president of the Florida State Teachers Association, the Black Teachers Association in Florida. And then she goes on to found one of the first Florida Club chapters in Florida. So she started early, founding things and organizations, and she really thought that this was a way, like the last one, the biggest one that she founded, the council, National Council of Negro Women, she really saw it. So it was 28 organizations or 35 organizations, but it was an organization of organizations. So all these Black women organizations in the nation, sororities, different clubs, the Women's Auxiliary of the Sleeping Car Porters, the Daughters of ISIS, the Daughters of it was Black people at church groups, like, there was quite a bit of infrastructure. And what she said is, let's all come together to become an organization of organizations that when something pressing is impacting Black women, if it's legislation, if it's lynching, we can all come together and bring the power of our various constituencies to bear. And we'll do more, we'll go farther, faster, if in those moments we come together. When we're not, otherwise you go off and do you. You have your organization, nobody's trying to take it over, you do it how you want to do it, but when it's time for us to rise up about something, we should all be able to come together. This was, no one had done that before, and I think about what it must have took to get that kind of range of Black organizations to trust each other enough to convene.
Well, it's an interesting idea, and with her as the linchpin. There are a couple of other questions here, and I think they mostly focus on you. For example, have to research to choose a figure as phenomenal and large and impactful, were you ever overwhelmed or intimidated by the amount of material, the material you were encountering, and then also this idea of, well, it's more than an idea, the fact that your family was so intimately impacted by Dr. Bethune. Do you have, could you tell us a
She
little
is
about that?
completely overwhelming, and she deserves what I did was pick certain themes from her life that resonated with me, and tell you why it mattered to me while telling you about her life, as opposed to saying she was born and then she said and then she did. I wanted, I was so moved by and in some ways overwhelmed by her service, her dedication, her love, her faith, that I wanted to make sure people knew why I think she mattered, at the same time that I wanted to talk about who she was. So I call it a biomemography. I mean, it's a little bit memoir, it's a little bit biography, and it's a lot of storytelling.
Well, it's an excellent book. I just wanted to ask you just one other question, and it really has to do with her sense of herself. You write very early in the book about an opportunity for her to speak in Birmingham to an integrated group of activists that were there to talk about in 1938 the social welfare of the greater good. And as it happens, Eleanor Roosevelt was there, and as Mary McCleod Bethune was about to speak, she was introduced to this, this group, this diverse group of leaders as Mary, and she said, "I'm Mrs. Mary Bethune."
My name is Mrs. Bethune. So in Birmingham, Alabama in 1938, she's in an integrated audience and speaking, and it's another one of these key kind of moments where she's helping to organize this group, and the white women are up at the front, and they say, "Oh, Mary, come address people," and she pulls herself up to 5 foot nothing. She was literally 5 foot tall, and it's like, "My name is Mrs. Bethune," and the person who was recounting this in the archives that I saw was like, "Oh my God, in Birmingham, Alabama in 1938, you didn't call Negro women Mrs." Like that was, and for her to stand up, I mean, it may seem like a small-ish thing now, but again, the white woman who was recounting this in the oral history that I read was like, it was just shock. Like she corrected, interrupted, and then said her name was Mrs. and stood there until the woman corrected herself and said, "Mrs. Bethune, come to the lectern." It's a moment of danger that people who know that period well understand, but it's also an illustration of when I say, she was like, "You gonna straighten up your back or not?" But if it's got to do with me, respect and courage, it has to be. So respect was key for her. And the other thing I will say, though, there is something in the book that I'm not going to go into. If you get it, you should read it, though, about the end of her life and how she sort of reflected on her relationship with her child. She became Mrs. Mary Bethune. She traveled internationally. She advised 4 different sitting presidents in the United States. She got the medals in Haiti, the highest medals of honor. People around the world are going, "You're an inspiration." And near the end of her life, she said, "Yeah, but it cost me my relationship with my child." And I was so busy becoming Mrs. Mary McCleod Bethune that I didn't notice what it was costing me in that regard. And I find that just, I think it's a perpetual thing, that when you aspire, I know so many artists and activists whose children have a story about what that cost them. So she was human. I think the easiest way to then just end that is to just say she was human.
And tremendous. And this was such a wonderful program. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for
this
having me.
evening.
This
And
was great.
Thank all
Thank y'all
of
for
you
coming.
and everyone out in the world. And have a great evening and safe travels back home.